there is a question that most people are too afraid to ask themselves, and it is this. If everything you dream about requires you to change, to suffer, to work in silence for years without any guarantee of reward, would you still do it? Or would you find a comfortable excuse and go back to the life you already know, the safe life, the small life, the life that asks nothing from you because you have already stopped asking anything from yourself? Sit with that question. Do not answer it quickly, because your first answer is probably a lie you have been telling yourself for a long time. And today, right here, that changes. Welcome to English to Inspire, the place where you learn real English and real lessons at the same time, where every word you hear is building your language and your mind together, because we believe that the person who is serious about growing never wastes a single moment, not even the moments spent listening. And if this is your first time here, then you arrived at exactly the right time. If this channel is giving you something that feels different, something that feels necessary, then take 1 second right now and subscribe. Because what we are building here together is not just vocabulary. It is a completely different way of seeing your own life. Today, we are going to talk about a man who grew up with almost nothing. A man who was rejected so many times that most people would have quit before the story even began. A man who sat in dark, cold rooms and wrote stories that nobody wanted. And who today is one of the most read authors in the entire history of human literature. His name is Stephen King. And before you think this story has nothing to do with you, understand this. The pain he felt when the world ignored him, the exhaustion he felt when the money ran out, the doubt he felt when he looked in the mirror and wondered if he was only fooling himself. That pain is the exact same pain sitting in your chest right now. Stephen King did not become great because he was lucky, or because life was kind to him, or because someone saw his talent and handed him a door to walk through. He became great because he refused, absolutely refused, to let reality be the final word on what was possible for his life. And that refusal, that quiet, burning, obsessive refusal, is the only thing that separates the people who make it from the people who almost made it. Almost is the saddest word in any language. And today we are going to make sure it is not the word that defines your story. So settle in, breathe, and listen closely, because every sentence you hear is training your English, and every story you absorb is training your soul. And the man we are about to follow grew up in a world that was trying, in every possible way, to make him believe that people like him did not get to have big dreams. And the first place that world tried to crush him was at the very beginning, in a childhood that offered him almost nothing except one extraordinary gift, which was a desperate need to escape into his own imagination. Stephen King was born on September 21st, 1947, in Portland, Maine. And before he was even old enough to understand what abandonment meant, he lived it completely. Because when he was just 2 years old, his father left the house one evening under the pretense of going to buy cigarettes, and simply never came back, never called, never wrote, never explained. And the silence that man left behind was the first great darkness that Stephen King ever had to learn to live inside of. A silence so loud and so heavy that it shaped everything he would eventually become, including every monster, every shadow, and every empty corridor he would one day put on a page for the entire world to feel. His mother, Nellie Ruth King, was left alone with 2 small boys and almost no money. And what she did next was not heroic in the way movies show heroism. It was not loud or celebrated. It was quiet and exhausting and relentless, because she worked jobs that hurt her body and humiliated her pride just to keep her children fed and clothed and sheltered, moving the family from city to city, from relative to relative, from one small rented room to the next. And young Stephen absorbed all of it, the instability, the uncertainty, the feeling of being one bad week away from having nothing at all. And that feeling never fully left him, even decades later, when his name was known everywhere. Stephen was a strange child, in the way that all truly creative children are strange, meaning the world inside his head was more real and more interesting to him than the world outside. And while other children played and ran and lived loudly in the sunshine, he was already disappearing into stories, first reading them with a hunger that frightened the adults around him, devouring comics and horror magazines and paperback novels that were far too dark for his age. And then, slowly and naturally and inevitably, he began to write his own, sitting alone and filling pages with creatures and curses and worlds where the fear had a shape, because giving fear a shape was the only way a powerless child knew how to control it. He was 10 years old when he wrote his first complete story, and he was so proud of it that he showed it to his mother, expecting nothing, maybe hoping for a smile. And she read it carefully, and then she looked at him and told him it was good, that it was really good. And in that single moment, something was confirmed inside him that no amount of future rejection would ever be able to fully destroy, which was the belief that the thing living inside him, this compulsive need to tell stories, was not a weakness or a waste of time, but was in fact the most real and most powerful thing about him. The one thing in a chaotic life that was entirely and completely his own. Poverty does not break everyone it touches, and sometimes, in the lives of certain rare people, it does something unexpected. It sharpens them. It removes every distraction and every comfort and leaves only the hunger, pure and clean and dangerous. And Stephen King grew up hungry in every sense of that word. Hungry for stability. Hungry for belonging. Hungry to prove that the boy nobody saw was capable of something the whole world would one day have to look at. And that hunger, forged in a cold childhood, without a father, and without certainty, was slowly becoming something that could not be contained. Something that needed an outlet. And it was already beginning to find one. There is a moment in the life of every serious person when they stop doing what they love casually and start doing it like their life depends on it. And for Stephen King, that moment came quietly during his teenage years, not with a dramatic announcement or a sudden revelation, but with a simple and almost frightening realization that he could not stop writing, even when he tried, even when there was no audience, even when there was no reward. Even when the practical world around him was telling him to focus on something real, something useful, something that would actually pay the bills one day. And instead of listening to that voice, he picked up his pen and he wrote another story, and then another after that. As a teenager, King was already producing work at a pace that most adult writers would find difficult to match, filling notebooks and loose pages with stories of horror and darkness and strange human behavior. And he was not doing this because someone asked him to, or because a teacher encouraged him, or because he had a clear plan for the future. He was doing it because the alternative, which was silence, which was stillness, which was a life lived only on the surface of things, felt completely unbearable to him. And this is something you need to understand about the people who eventually break through. They are not more talented than everyone else in the beginning. They are simply more unable to quit. More physically incapable of walking away from the thing that owns them. He started submitting his short stories to magazines when he was still in high school, horror and science fiction publications that paid small amounts of money to writers whose work they selected. And the first thing the world gave him in return for his courage was rejection, clean and direct and without apology. Form letters that said no thank you, that said this does not meet our needs, that said try again elsewhere. And King did something with those rejection letters that reveals everything you need to know about the kind of man he was becoming. He did not hide them. He did not throw them away. He took a nail and hammered it into the wall above his desk, and he put every single rejection letter on that nail, one after another, watching the stack grow, treating it not as evidence of his failure, but as a record of his persistence, as proof that he was in the fight. By the time he was 16, the nail could no longer hold the weight of all the rejection letters, and he replaced it with a spike, a thick metal spike that could carry far more. And he kept writing and kept submitting and kept collecting the no's, because he understood something that most people never learn, which is that rejection is not the opposite of success. Rejection is the path to success. And every no that came back to him was confirmation that he was actually doing the work, actually sending the work out, actually participating in the process, while everyone else who had a dream but no discipline was sitting safely at home doing nothing, and wondering why nothing was happening for them. His first real sale came when he was 18 years old. A short story sold for a small amount of money to a magazine called Startling Mystery Stories, and the amount he received was not life-changing. It was not even significant by any financial measure, but what it represented was enormous, because it meant that someone, somewhere, had read what he created, and decided it had value, decided it deserved to exist in the world. And King took that small confirmation, and he used it like fuel. Understanding that one yes, after 100 no's, does not mean the journey is over. It means the journey has just truly and finally begun. And he was only getting started. There is something that nobody tells you about the years between deciding what you want and actually getting it, and that something is this. Those years are not glamorous. They are not cinematic. They do not look like the training montage in a movie where everything moves fast and the music swells and you can see the progress happening in real time. Those years look like a person sitting alone in a bad room under bad lighting doing the same thing over and over again while the world outside moves on without them. While friends get normal jobs and buy normal things and live normal lives, and you sit there wondering in your darkest moments whether you are brave or whether you are simply foolish. And the only way you ever find out is by refusing to stop. Stephen King entered his 20s with a dream that was still mostly invisible to the world around him, still living inside notebooks and rejection letters and small publications that paid almost nothing. And the practical weight of adult life was beginning to press down on him with a force that had no interest in his ambitions. Because the bills existed, whether he was writing or not. Because the rent was due, whether the stories were selling or not, and King was not a man living in isolation from responsibility. He was a man trying to carry a dream in one hand, while carrying the crushing weight of survival in the other. And most people who attempt that eventually drop one of the two things they are holding. And almost always, it is the dream that falls first. He worked jobs that had nothing to do with writing, and everything to do with keeping his head above water. Working in an industrial laundry facility where the heat was unbearable and the hours were long and the work left his hands raw and his back aching. And then later pumping gas at a station where the winters in Maine were brutal and the pay was barely enough to matter. And he did all of this without self-pity, without the kind of public suffering that some people perform when life is hard. He did it quietly, and then he came home and he sat down and he wrote. Because the work was not something he did when conditions were perfect. The work was something he did regardless of conditions, and that distinction is everything. The rejection letters continued to arrive, and the pile on the spike above his desk continued to grow, and there were certainly moments, honest moments that he has spoken about in his own words, where the doubt crept in like cold air under a door, where he wondered if the world was trying to tell him something. If all these closed doors were a message, he was too stubborn to read correctly. But then he would look at the spike on the wall, and instead of seeing failure, he would see volume. He would see the sheer number of attempts he had made, and he would understand that a person who has tried that many times and kept going is not a person the universe has rejected. The universe simply has not caught up yet to what that person is building. What King was doing during those hard years was not just surviving, and not just writing. He was developing something that cannot be taught in any classroom and cannot be rushed by any amount of talent. He was developing the specific kind of mental toughness that only comes from continuing to move forward when every external signal is telling you to stop. And this toughness was not loud or aggressive. It was quiet and deeply personal. It was the decision made alone in a room with no audience and no applause to simply keep going one more day, and then one more day after that. And it was in this silence, in this invisible discipline, that the foundation of everything that was coming was being laid, one rejected page at a time. Picture this moment clearly in your mind, because it is important, and it is real. A young man and a young woman living in a small rented trailer with 2 young children. The walls thin enough that the cold comes through in winter. The budget so tight that there are weeks where the choice between buying food and paying a bill is not a metaphor but an actual decision that has to be made at an actual kitchen table. And that young man comes home from a job he does not love. a teaching job at a local high school where he is doing his best to give something to his students while quietly feeling like he is slowly disappearing from his own life. And after dinner and after the children are in bed, he sits down not on a proper desk in a proper office, but on a small chair wedged into the narrow space between the washing machine and the dryer, balancing a child's small desk on his knees. And he writes. That young man was Stephen King, and the young woman was Tabitha King, whom he had met at university and married in 1971. And what Tabitha represented in Stephen's life was not just love and partnership in a romantic sense, but something even more essential during those years, which was belief. The specific and powerful belief of one person in another person's worth, when the entire outside world seems indifferent. And she worked her own jobs to help keep the family above water. And she watched her husband come home tired and still sit down to write. And she did not ask him to stop. She did not suggest that maybe it was time to be practical. She held the space around his dream, even when that dream had not yet given them a single reason to believe it would ever pay off. The writing King was doing in that trailer was not small or cautious or safe. He was working on a story about a girl named Carrie, a teenage girl who was bullied and humiliated and ignored and who carried inside her a power she did not yet understand. And it would be impossible not to notice how much of King's own life was in that character. How much of his own experience of feeling invisible and powerless and underestimated was living inside this fictional girl. Because the best writers do not invent their pain, they excavate it. They go down into the darkest parts of their own experience, and they bring something up from the bottom that other people recognize. Immediately, because they have been down there too. They just did not know how to say what they found. But King stopped. He wrote the opening pages of Carrie, and then he stopped, and he threw those pages in the trash can because he did not believe in them. Because he was not sure he understood teenage girls well enough to write their world convincingly. Because the doubt that lives inside every creative person, regardless of their talent or their experience, suddenly spoke louder than the story itself. And those pages sat in the trash where he had abandoned them until Tabitha found them, pulled them out, read them carefully, and then came to him and told him that what he had written was powerful, that Carrie was real, that the story mattered, and that he needed to finish it. And that single act of faith from one human being to another is sometimes all that stands between a great work and complete silence. He finished Carrie because his wife believed in it when he did not, and he sent it out into the world the same way he had sent everything else, without certainty, without any guarantee, carrying only the habit of trying that he had built across years of rejection and silence, an invisible work done in the worst possible conditions. And what came back this time was not a nail full of no's. What came back was something completely different. Something that neither he nor Tabitha could have fully prepared themselves for emotionally. Even though in the deepest and most honest part of himself, King had always known, always felt, that if he just kept going long enough, the world would eventually have no choice but to answer him. There are phone calls that divide a life into before and after. Calls that arrive on an ordinary afternoon when you are doing something completely unremarkable. When you are washing dishes or sitting on the porch or staring out a window thinking about how to pay next month's rent, and in a single moment, everything that came before, all the struggle and the silence and the rejection and the doubt, all of it suddenly reorganizes itself into something that looks less like suffering and more like preparation. And Stephen King received one of those calls in the spring of 1973. A call from his agent telling him that Doubleday Publishing had agreed to buy the hardcover rights to Carrie, and the advance was $2,500, which was not a large amount of money, even by the standards of that time. But it was real. It was confirmation. It was the world finally saying yes, after years of saying nothing. But that was only the beginning of what that phone call meant, because the publishing industry works in layers. And while the hardcover sale was the first yes, the second yes was the one that genuinely changed everything. Because paperback rights to novels are sold separately in the paperback market in the 1970s was enormous, reaching millions of readers who could not afford hardcover prices. And when the paperback rights to Carrie went to auction, the number that came back was not $2,500. The number that came back was $400,000, and King's agent called him again to deliver this second piece of news, and King who was at school teaching, had to find a payphone to call Tabitha, and when he told her the number, she did not believe him, and he did not fully believe it himself, because $400,000 was not a number that belonged in the world they had been living in. Think about what that moment means beyond the money, because the money is almost the least important part of the story even, though it solved real and immediate problems in a real and immediate way, paying off debts, and moving the family out of the trailer and giving them a stability they had never known. But what that moment really represented was the validation of a choice. The confirmation that all those years of writing in bad rooms on bad furniture for no audience and no reward were not a delusion, were not a waste, were not the foolish behavior of a man who should have known better. They were an investment, a long and painful and invisible investment in something that the world had finally decided to value. And the return on that investment was not just financial, it was existential. This is the part of the story where most people think the lesson is about luck, where they say Stephen King got his big break and everything changed. And they use that word break as though fortune reached down randomly and touched one person out of millions for no particular reason. But that reading of the story is lazy, and it is wrong, and it is dangerous because it lets you off the hook. It lets you sit back and wait for your own break to arrive as though breaks are distributed like weather, randomly and without logic. When the truth is that King's moment did not come because luck found him. It came because he had put himself in the path of that moment so many thousands of times, through so many submissions and so many rejections and so many hours of work, that eventually the moment had nowhere else to go. What you need to carry with you from this part of his story is not the number 400,000. What you need to carry is the image of the man before that number existed. The man at the washing machine desk, the man pinning rejection letters to a spike, the man throwing pages in the trash and having his wife pull them back out, because that man is the real lesson. That man is the version of Stephen King that actually did the work. And the wealth and the fame that followed were simply the delayed receipt for a payment he had already made in full across years of invisible and unrewarded effort. And the question that should be sitting uncomfortably in your chest right now is a simple one. What payment are you making today, in silence, in discipline, in the hours when nobody is watching, toward the life you say you want to be living? There is a truth about success that the success itself tries to hide from you. And the truth is this: the same intensity that drives a person to the top of their field does not automatically know how to rest once it gets there. It does not automatically transform into peace or contentment or gratitude. It keeps moving because moving is all it has ever known. And sometimes that intensity, that restless burning energy that refused to let you quit when quitting would have been easy, turns inward and starts to consume the very person it was supposed to serve. And this is not a story about weakness. This is a story about what happens when a human being who has been running on hunger for decades suddenly finds that the hunger has been fed, but the running has not stopped. Stephen King became famous fast, and the world embraced him with a force that was genuinely overwhelming. Carrie was followed by Salem's Lot, and then The Shining, and then The Stand, and then book after book after book, each one confirming that this was not a one-time event, but a sustained and almost supernatural creative force that showed no signs of slowing down. And the money came, and the recognition came, and the interviews came, and the movie adaptations came, and from the outside everything looked like the perfect conclusion to a story about perseverance and talent and delayed reward. But inside the house, inside the man himself, something was happening that the public did not see, and that King himself was not fully able to see clearly until much later. Because he had begun to drink, and then he had begun to do more than drink. The alcohol started the way it always starts. Casually and socially, and with complete plausibility. A drink to celebrate. A finished manuscript. A drink to relax after a long tour. A drink because the anxiety that had always lived in him had more room to grow now that the external struggle had been removed. And then gradually and then completely, the casual drink became something else. Became a need. Became a daily requirement. Became the thing that had to happen before the writing could happen. And alongside the alcohol came cocaine. And King has spoken about this period with a brutal and almost clinical honesty in his memoir called On Writing, admitting that there are entire books from this era of his life that he does not remember writing. Entire novels produced in a blackout of substance and excess that he can only verify he wrote, because the manuscripts exist and the handwriting is his. This is the part of the story where you have to resist the temptation to judge and instead choose to understand. Because what King was experiencing was not the behavior of a man who had stopped caring or stopped trying. It was the behavior of a man who had never learned to exist without pain as his fuel, who had built his entire identity around the struggle and then found himself in a strange and disorienting territory where the struggle had changed shape, where the enemy was no longer poverty or rejection but something internal and invisible and far harder to fight, and the substances were not an escape from responsibility. They were a misguided attempt to keep the engine running, to keep the darkness at bay, to keep producing, because producing was the only way he knew how to justify his own existence. The people closest to him saw what he could not see, and eventually Tabitha, the same woman who had pulled Kerry out of the trash and believed in him when he did not believe in himself, organized an intervention, gathering family and friends, and confronting him with the evidence of what he had become, laying out the bottles and the pills and the truth in a room he could not leave. And King has said that he was angry and resistant and in complete denial, and that the intervention worked anyway, not because he was ready, but because the people who loved him refused to pretend anymore. And the decision to get sober was the second most important decision of his life, the first being the decision all those years ago to keep writing no matter what. And both decisions required the same thing, which was the courage to face an uncomfortable truth and choose the harder path anyway. On the 19th of June, 1999, Stephen King was walking along the shoulder of a road near his home in Lavelle, Maine, doing something completely ordinary, something millions of people do every single day without a second thought. He was taking a walk in the afternoon, breathing the summer air, existing in the simple and unremarkable way that healthy people exist when they are not thinking about mortality or fragility or how quickly and completely a life can change direction. And then a van driven by a man named Brian Smith drifted off the road and struck him from behind, and in a matter of seconds the most important writer of his generation was lying in a ditch with a broken hip, a broken leg broken in 9 places, a broken knee for broken ribs, a damaged spine, and a collapsed lung. And the doctors who treated him in the hours that followed were not certain he would walk again, and some of them were not certain he would survive. The physical recovery was long and brutal, in a way that is difficult to fully communicate through words alone, because pain at that level is not just physical. It is psychological and existential, and it reaches into the deepest parts of your identity and asks questions that comfortable living never asks. Questions like, who are you without the thing that defines you? Questions like, what remains of a person when everything they built their sense of self around is suddenly and violently taken away? And King could not sit comfortably, could not stand comfortably, could not lie down comfortably. Every position was a negotiation with agony, and the painkillers that were medically necessary created their own complications for a man who had already fought one battle with substances and understood exactly how seductive chemical relief could be. He began writing again approximately 6 weeks after the accident, not because the pain had subsided, not because the doctors had cleared him, not because the conditions were anywhere close to comfortable or manageable, but because not writing was its own kind of pain, a deeper and more personal pain than anything the broken bones could produce. And his wife set up a desk for him in a room, and he sat down with his legs elevated, and his body held together by metal and medicine and sheer will. And he opened a manuscript and he continued, and the act of continuing was not heroic in the way people romanticize heroism. It was not beautiful or inspiring in the moment. It was desperate and necessary and human. It was a man refusing to let a random act of violence write the final sentence of his story. He wrote about the accident itself, processing it the way writers process everything, by transforming it into language, by making it into something that could be examined and understood, and eventually released. And what emerged from that period of recovery was not bitterness, and not self-pity, but something much more valuable. which was a renewed and almost fierce appreciation for the act of writing itself, for the simple fact of being alive and conscious and capable of putting one word after another, because he had been close enough to the end to understand with his entire body, and not just his intellect, that the opportunity to do the work is not permanent, that the window does not stay open forever, that every single day you choose not to begin is a day you are choosing to waste something genuinely irreplaceable. The man who came out of that recovery was not the same man who had walked onto that road in June, and the difference was not weakness. The difference was clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives when everything unnecessary has been stripped away by force, when life has grabbed you by the shoulders and shown you exactly how fragile and exactly how precious the whole thing is. And King returned to his work with a focus and a gratitude that infused everything he wrote afterward, understanding that the accident had not interrupted his story but had in fact deepened it, had given him access to a layer of human experience that he could not have reached any other way. And that access, that hard-won and painful access, was now available to every reader who would ever pick up one of his books and find themselves, without quite knowing why, feeling less alone in the dark. Stephen King has written and published more than 60 novels, more than 200 short stories, and has sold more than 500 million copies of his books worldwide. And those numbers are so large that they stop feeling real after a certain point. They become abstract. They become statistics. And statistics do not move people the way stories do. So instead of dwelling on the numbers, consider this single image. Somewhere in the world right now, at this exact moment, a person who feels completely alone and completely misunderstood is sitting in a dark room, holding one of his books, and inside those pages, they are finding something they could not find anywhere else, which is the confirmation that the darkness they feel inside themselves is not unique, is not shameful, is not a sign that something is wrong with them, but is in fact the most human thing about them. And that confirmation is worth more than any number of copies sold or any amount of money earned. But the legacy of Stephen King is not only about the books themselves, it is about the philosophy behind the books. The philosophy of work and discipline and consistency that he has shared openly and generously, most completely in his memoir and guide called On Writing, which is not really a book about how to write horror stories, but is instead a book about how to live a creative life with honesty and courage, and without the kind of self-deception that kills more dreams than failure ever could. And the central message of that philosophy is so simple that it is almost offensive in its simplicity, which is this: if you want to be a writer, you must do two things above all others. You must read a lot, and you must write a lot. And there are no shortcuts, and there are no exceptions, and there is no alternative path that leads to the same destination. King writes every single day, including his birthday, including holidays, including the days when the ideas are not flowing and the words feel wrong and the whole project seems pointless, and the internal critic is loudest and most convincing. And he writes a minimum of 2,000 words every single day without negotiation. And when people ask him how he is so prolific, when they ask him where the ideas come from and how he maintains the output across decades, his answer is always some version of the same thing, which is that he simply shows up, that he treats the writing the way a plumber treats plumbing, or the way a carpenter treats carpentry, as a craft that is practiced daily and improved through repetition, and that does not wait for inspiration to arrive before beginning. Because inspiration is a visitor that only comes to people it finds already working. This philosophy is not romantic, and it is not flattering to the part of us that wants to believe that great work comes from magical moments of divine inspiration that descend on chosen people. Because the truth King is describing is much more demanding and much more democratic than that. It is saying that the difference between the person who writes one book and the person who writes 60 is not talent. It is not genius. It is not some mysterious inner fire that only certain people possess. It is simply the daily decision to sit down and do the work, whether you feel like it or not. And that decision, repeated thousands of times across decades, is what separates the body of work that changes a culture from the collection of good intentions that never became anything at all. There is something else King has said that deserves to live inside you long after this narration ends, and it is this: talent is cheaper than table salt. And what separates the talented individual from the successful one is a lot of hard work. And when you hear that, you might feel a complicated mix of things. You might feel inspired, and you might feel uncomfortable, and you might feel a specific kind of guilt that comes from recognizing yourself in a description you did not expect. The description of a talented person who has not yet done the work. And that guilt is not something to run from. That guilt is information. That guilt is your own inner voice, using the story of Stephen King to tell you something urgent about your own life, and your own choices, and your own remaining time. And the question now is whether you are finally ready to listen to what it is saying. So here we are, at the end of a life we have walked through together. A life that began in abandonment and poverty and silence, and ended in something so vast and so permanent that no amount of time will ever fully erase it. And the question that should be sitting in the center of your chest right now, the question that should be making it slightly difficult to breathe, is not about Stephen King at all. It is about you. It is about the specific and personal and completely honest answer to this. What are you doing with the time you have been given? Not in general, not in theory, not in the version of your life you describe to other people, but in reality, in the actual hours of your actual days, and the choices you make when nobody is watching and no one will ever know. Are you building something or are you consuming something? Are you creating or are you only observing the creation of others? Stephen King did not have better hours than you have. He did not have a more cooperative universe, or a more forgiving set of circumstances, or a life that made the work easier. He had an absent father, and an exhausted mother, and a trailer with thin walls, and a child's desk, between a washing machine and a dryer and a spike on the wall full of rejection, and a body, broken by a van on a summer road. And he wrote. Anyway, he wrote through the rejection, and through the poverty, and through the fame, and through the addiction, and through the recovery, and through the physical agony. He wrote. Because stopping was never a real option for him, and the only question worth asking yourself right now is whether you are ready to make the same decision about whatever your version of the work is. Whether you are ready to remove stopping from the list of available options. You have been listening to this narration in English, which means you are already doing something that most people in your position are not doing. You are choosing growth over comfort. You are choosing the harder path over the easier one. You are sitting with a language that is not yet fully yours, and refusing to let that difficulty be a reason to stop. And that choice, that small daily choice to keep going in the face of difficulty, is the exact same muscle that Stephen King used every single day of his creative life. And the fact that you are here, that you finished this, that you followed this story from a cold childhood in Maine, all the way to this moment, tells me something important about you. It tells me that the hunger is there, and hunger is the only raw material that actually matters. But hunger without direction is just pain. And direction without action is just fantasy. And so what comes next cannot be another day of thinking about the thing you want to build. Another evening of imagining the life you want to live. Another night of going to sleep with your potential still completely intact and completely unused. Because potential that is never converted into action is not a gift. It is a weight. It is a debt you owe to the version of yourself that is waiting on the other side of your discipline. And that version of you is not asking for perfection, is not asking for genius, is not asking for the right moment or the right conditions or the right amount of confidence. That version of you is asking for one thing only, which is for you to begin. The clock that was running when Stephen King sat down between that washing machine and that dryer is the same clock that is running for you right now. And it does not pause for doubt, and it does not slow down for fear, and it does not stop for the days when you do not feel ready. It moves at exactly the same speed, regardless of what you choose to do with it. And every hour that passes is an hour that belonged to you, and that you either used or surrendered. And the world is full of stories that were never written, and businesses that were never built, and lives that were never fully lived by people who were talented enough and hungry enough and who simply waited one day too long to begin. And your story is not finished yet, which means you still have a choice. And the only question that remains is a simple one. What are you going to do right now, today, in the next hour, with the time that is still yours?